The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Christine Westerland here, and
Susan Wilson.
as you know, I'm with ICA. Susan is with CEFS. This is webinar number 5, right, Susan?
Number 5.
Am I counting
Yeah.
correctly? Wow. We
Time
really
flies.
it does fly. I have a little sign that I keep up here in my kitchen on my dry board that says quarantine day 49. So just in case we all want to keep track. We're so happy that you're with us this morning to have yet another ROMA webinar. We're excited. I don't have I guess I already advanced my slide without thinking about it. Let me go back to the opening slide. Introduction to ROMA, that is what we're doing. We're fortunate enough to have this collaboration with DCEO that supports our webinar. So we're very grateful for that partnership. And Susan, I'm very grateful for our partnership on this.
We work well together, Christine.
We do work well together, Susan, and I really appreciate the insight that you bring. You are a practitioner of Roma, and so you bring so much insight into this, and I really appreciate you being along for this fun ride that we're on.
Yeah, what I hope to get across to people is that this is not something big and scary and an interruption of your work. It's just a way to guide you and help document the good work that you do. It sounded scary when I was chosen, elected, designated to be the Roma professional for our agency. I was a little intimidated, but you know what? All it does is clarify things. It's not interruption of my work. It's a clarification and a documentation of it.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you bringing that out for everyone, Susan. And I think that is the piece of it that we really need to say. This is something that doesn't lay on top of the work that you're currently doing. This is something that you do. You embed it into your practices. It is not a burden. Perhaps gaining the credential might seem a little bit like a burden, but really in the bigger picture, this is something that really does help your agency to really tell your story. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is a tool that really does promote that idea of storytelling. So here are our mugs, just so you can kind of remember what we look like. I need to remember when my hair was that short.
Yes, I am anxious for another trip to the salon.
Yeah. Aren't we all? But it's okay that we are not. And I hate to mention how much gray has entered into my hair, but that's another story for another time. And just to point out here, these initials that are underneath both of our names, Susan is both a trainer and an implementer, nationally certified Roma trainer and implementer, duly credentialed. And I think that is really just a great thing for CEFS to have the vision to have you hold both of those, because you really are that fully rounded Roma professional at the organization. I have the privilege of being a master trainer. I have been a Roma trainer since 2001, which seems kind of like a strange thing to say out loud. And and I have seen this evolve into what it is today. And I have to say that all the improvements that have been made over the years are remarkable. And I think now there's more clarity and vision now that we actually can promote some of this and do some of this remotely. So things are changing all the time, and boy, aren't we happy about it. As we do kick off each of our webinars, I encourage you to, let's say together, whether it's silent or out loud, the promise of community action. It's an important statement for us to remember just the value and the importance of the work they do, that we all do in collaboration. So, community action, changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place
to live.
We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated
to helping people
help themselves and each other. Okay. So here is the Roma cycle. We have been, during the course of these 5 webinars, have been working our way around the Roma cycle. And I will say the tool that we're introducing today really touches both the planning piece of the cycle and the evaluation piece of the cycle. The logic model is something that honestly that we are all familiar with, even though we may not believe that. And so we really want to break down the logic model for you today and really connect it back to this work that we do in the ROMA cycle. So, as I said, logic models are about managing and evaluating performance. So we're honestly always looking at this. You have seen this logic model in every webinar that we have had.
Yes.
All five. And we have talked about pieces of it throughout this webinar. Is that fair to say, Susan?
We have gone through several of the columns, and we'll finish out the columns today, will we not?
Yes, that is the plan.
Okay.
So let's proceed. So this is really just kind of a rough, not a rough, this is kind of an overview of what a logic model is. And I often use this idea that we're telling stories in community action. You probably have heard me say that multiple times. But what is a logic model? It truly is a story with a connecting narrative. The data that is entered into all 8 columns must match or be connected to the other columns. We want to see our stories match. And it's important for us to think through each piece of this. It can also be used to capture short, intermediate, or long-term outcomes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. And that logic models can be used with scales to analyze data for improved management and decision making. So you're really using, you're checking relationships of planned interventions, you're communicating with funders, that's a great tool for that, and other key stakeholders. You're really tracking progress and you really want to improve decision making. I know I said that already, but I want to just reiterate it, just how important it is, the logic model, the role the logic model can serve in the work that you do.
Yes, put simply, a logic model is a story map of data. It shows outcomes, how they happened, and how they're documented.
So if we want to think then about what is it that we're looking at when we see the logic model, well, you know what? We know logic models, right? Here are some examples of logic models that many of us have deep familiarity with, right? I don't know about you, Susan, but I received a report card my entire time I was in school.
Yes, some of them I'm not so proud of, but yes. And you know what makes a report card an excellent example of a logic model is it shows a gain in knowledge and it shows progress over time, and it's quantitative. And my report cards always had a place for qualitative discussions as well. So it's a very good example of a logic model.
Yeah, absolutely. And so remember back to your report cards, and again, that value, as Susan brought up again, that we are looking at both qualitative and quantitative data, and a report card does that for us. It tells the story of how we're doing, or how we should perhaps improve. And so this is something that we all are very comfortable with. Some other examples of logic models that are on here are some that you are very familiar with, although you may not view them as being, again, a logic model. If you have bought an appliance within the last, I think, 15 to 20 years, perhaps even longer, the federal government requires an energy guide to be placed on that appliance, whether it's a washer or a dryer or a refrigerator or a hot water heater, a stove, what have you. This is something that you see because it tells you how much energy, what your energy costs are going to be, and other expectations that you would have or hold with that particular appliance that you've purchased. Likewise, when you have purchased a new or a used car, you get a statement, a sticker typically, as a part of that, of the value of the car, that discusses the fuel economy and the environmental costs. Again, that's mandated by both the Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Transportation. If you have bought any food at all within the last, I don't know, several
Lifetime,
years,
yes.
lifetime, then you have these nutrition facts. And I don't know about you, but the older I get, the more closely I pay attention to this. given all sorts of restrictions that people have as they age. But this is an important little piece of information, and we see that this label on practically every food product that we purchase, including candy bars. Just putting it out there.
That's right. But it shows relationships. It communicates the data to us. It helps us assess what's going on. So it is a logic model in a different sort of way.
Right. And I think that's the key piece of it, right? There are, again, we walk in and out of logic models our entire time that we're on this planet, but we don't view them as a logic model. A couple of other logic models that are here. If you have had a child, or if you're familiar with individual education plans, all of that documentation is done via a logic model. And I will say that one of my children had an IEP, and I always thought that it was just so well laid out, and I could completely understand it and knew exactly at any point in time where my child was in their progress in their educational path. The other thing, and it's not the best example, but also if you leave a doctor's office, I don't know if you've noticed, but you're typically given or emailed a report or a document that indicates what happened while you were at the doctor's office that day. And it lists all your medications. It typically will list the things that you've seen the doctor for. It also will have plans for future care, future interventions, if you will, when you see your doctor again. That's true if you have a loved one in a care facility. You meet with the nursing staff and you receive nursing reports, so that it's laying out for you really what the health outputs and outcomes are, the inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Okay. So we all have we're all nodding our heads and saying, oh yeah, I know what logic models are now, right?
That's right. That's right. Different format, but the ideas are the same.
So then we have to address this question, why should we use a logic model? So
well,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Susan.
Okay. We can use them to check the relationships of planned interventions and outcomes. Do our interventions work? Do our services give us the outcomes we're looking for? We can communicate with funders and other stakeholders how our work is done, how it's documented, how we have a plan. We can track progress towards goals, and as part of the ROMA cycle, indeed, is to assess our work. This can help improve our decision making. If it worked well, how can we maintain that? If it didn't work, what is it that we need to change to make sure that we can be successful in eliminating the effects of poverty? All right. Understanding the logic model. I'll give some examples here, and as we go through the slides, we'll have more examples, because I know that some of you work only in specific programs, and so we'll try to hit on as many of your daily activities as we can. One of the things we do when we understand our logic model is to identify our need. What do we need to fix? An example would be individuals lack job skills. That would be a need or a problem. An intervention, well, if individuals lack job skills, an intervention would be individuals get job training. An outcome would be individuals gain job skills. Really, it's very simple to, if the need is they lack job skills, the outcome would be they gain job skills. A projected outcome indicator, the OI stands for outcome indicator. So I'm going to give a number to this. Let's say 25 people get enrolled in CNA classes, and out of that, 10 of them earn CNA certificates. So 10 out of 25 would be my projected outcome. My actual outcome indicator actually had 11 out of the 25 earn their CNA certificates. So then I need column 6 through 8 show us accountability. So the accountability, how do I know that people gained those job skills? Well, a CNA certificate itself shows a gain in knowledge, a change in ability. So the certificate itself is a measurement tool. The data procedures, well, who makes copies of those certificates? Where are they stored? Where do they come from? What happens with those? And the frequency of data. That would be dependent on your program. Sometimes it's at the completion of a training. Perhaps it's at the end of each semester. Maybe it's the end of each quarter. Your yearly reports. You have to make that decision for what's going on. So it's important in a logic model to see that the outcomes meet the need. If the need is individuals need jobs, then the outcome should be individuals get jobs, perhaps by having resume assistance or interview coaching. If the need is the community lacks jobs, then the outcome should be the community creates jobs, perhaps by bringing in an industry. Notice in my example, I said the problem was individuals lack job skills, so the outcome could be individuals gain job skills. The measurement tool proved a gain in job skills. That was the CNA certificates. And we'll have more examples as Christine forwards the slides. This is a logic model checklist. I know that it's small on your screen, but you should be familiar with what one looks like. As you review this webinar later, Christine, is your dog excited?
Yes.
All excited about ROMA, no doubt. The mission is identified. Your intervention has to match the need. It includes a time frame, and the outcome must be realistic and attainable. Now, it would sound wonderful if we all said we would have 100% success rate. Christine, wouldn't that be great if all CSBG programs were 100% successful?
It would be fabulous, but honestly, it's not going to happen, right?
Actually, if you reported a 100% success rate, it would raise a flag. Because how many professional baseball players bat 1,000? None. Not a single one bats 1,000. So don't feel that you have to have a high success rate either. Is it reasonable to suggest that maybe 25% of your customers succeed, 25% of your clients meet an outcome? Then if that's reasonable, make that your goal. This is planting season, and I have heard on social media that many people are planting gardens right now. And if you get a packet of seeds, and let's just guess there are 100 seeds in that packet, how many of those seeds do you think will become a full-grown plant? I can guarantee you it won't be 100%. In fact, it might be 1%, 2%, 5%. So 100% is a great goal, but you have to be realistic. The last bullet on the left column is measurable, realistic, clear, and attainable. And usually 100% is simply just not realistic. On the right-hand side, the outcome indicators include the number expected to achieve the outcome. So maybe out of my flower packet, I only expect 5 full-grown plants out of 100 seeds. The number of people served, and a time frame. Now, a time frame can be immediate, such as a family getting emergency housing that night, or a family getting a meal that day. Sometimes your time frame takes years because they're saving for a down payment on a house, or it might take years to graduate with a degree, or it can take years to get an industry to come to town to provide jobs. There's absolutely no one right answer for any of these because it depends so much on the variables of your program, of your agency, of your community, and of the needs. What is important is to have measurement tools. How do you know that you are successful? And remember, in the style of ROMA, you're not successful when you provide a service. You're successful when you've made a measurable change, when there's a gain, when there's an outcome. And then how do you document that? Who collects it? Who stores it? Where is it stored? How often is it reported? Those are important things too that are noted on the logic model. All right, Christine, next slide.
Okay, and I am back. I think the barking is cease. My apologies to everybody.
It adds a hominess to our webinar.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at an emergency housing example to really kind of see the practical application of all the things that Susan just went over in the logic model checklist. One thing that I will point out is that when you go through introduction to ROMA training, as we encourage all of you to do, that it does come with a manual, and that logic model checklist is in that manual. But however, should you want the logic model checklist now, drop me an email. Be more than happy to send it to you. All right, so here is an example of a logic model that is focused on emergency housing. A couple of things I'll point out, and then I'll let Susan describe some of this to you as well. But you'll see that that it is a family program is what we're looking at. But I think the other thing that I think it's important for us to point out is at the bottom of this logic model, the mission statement is noted. And here the mission statement is to ensure all families have access to safe, clean shelter. So that is probably not the mission of the agency itself, but the mission of that particular program. And I think that is something clearly that you could consider. And Susan, I'll toss it over to you. I know that you have talked about the importance of having that specific mission statement for programs.
Yes. When Christine or one of the other ROMA trainers comes to your agency, we do spend quite a bit of time on mission statements because it does give a very solid focus, and all of your outcomes should be toward the end of meeting your mission statement. And your agency no doubt has a mission statement, but does your program, if you do housing or if you do Head Start or if you do weatherization, do you have a mission statement? We can help you write one. That's one of the activities we do when we get to be face-to-face again, and we come out to your agency. And within the mission statement, if the goal is to make sure families have access to clean, safe shelter, then those who are at risk of being evicted on this model, or the families who are homeless, they solve that problem. The outcome is they're going to remain in their residence or they obtain emergency shelter.
Right, and you'll notice what Susan just did there is that she identified what the problem was and then immediately jumped to column 3, the impact. So now we're going to come back then and look at the intervention, which is column 2.
Yeah, I did skip around, but
well, I think you're supposed to. I mean, ideally,
yeah,
ideally, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I kind of think of that as a GPS. If I'm going to if I'm in my car and I'm driving, I kind of have to put my address in before my GPS can tell me how to get there. I have to know what my goal is before it's determined how I get to my goal.
Absolutely. So if we were to look at the service or activity after the outcome has been stated, then we need to kind of consider what the intervention is. And remember, we'll talk about the pairing with a logic model and a scale here in just a little bit. But here they've identified that 200 families will receive emergency housing assistance. And for 150 of those families, it will consist of an emergency rent payment of 1 month. And then for 50 of the families, it will be emergency shelter. Again, we already know what the outcome is. We hope what the outcome will be, in which people are either remaining in their own residence or they will be able to obtain emergency shelter. But then let's look at the actual indicators, because this is where you project the number and percentage of those individuals that you believe will be able to achieve this outcome. So if you look at how it's broken down, it's looking at from the folks that are risk of being evicted, it breaks it down from 3 different areas, people who stay in their homes for 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. And then if we look at the homeless, if we're following the outcome indicator, we see that it is 50 or 100% of all those families were able to be housed in an emergency shelter.
Now, their goal was 100%, and if they are able to expect that and achieve that, that's fabulous. Very few of us will put 100% though, but perhaps this program has that capability.
That's really quite possible, and I think in both nutrition programs and in housing programs, especially at this level, you typically can look at higher numbers. But that's, as you said, that is not always true, certainly. So then we get to, after the service has been provided, then we actually need to go back then and measure what the actual results were. And that's also, we're including numbers and percentages there. This is the achievement. Again, we're examining impact program results, but this is where we see what really happened. And you'll see there is a shift in those numbers, particularly at the families who are at risk of being evicted. You'll see that 95% were able to stay in their home for 30 days, but the numbers begin to jump down. 88% in their own residence for 60, or 90 of the 150, 60% for 90 days. So it's interesting to see again how this all progresses and the value of following individuals. And then if we look at in families who are homeless, we still see that 50 of the 50 or 100% obtained emergency shelter lasting no longer than 30 days. Of course, it begs the question, what happened to them after those 30 days? We can have that conversation at another time.
Right. And notice, even though this column is in the middle of the model, it's filled in last. Now, the model does flow logically because we plan how are we going to get there, where are we going, and what happened, but you don't fill it out left to right. You fill it out as is appropriate, and this just happens to be the last thing because you don't know what your results are, of course, until you're done.
Mm-hmm. So that then gets us into the accountability side of this logic model, in which, as Susan did a beautiful job of going over all those elements in the checklist, that we're going to be looking at the measurement tools. That's what do you have? Is it the case record? Is it a rental assistance? You're keeping notes or a progress log on your clients. You may have, if you're in a homeless shelter, there's probably a shelter log that you could use as your measurement tool if they're receiving housing. If we then look at the next column, we see where the data sources, the procedures, and the personnel are noted. So we see that data is entered into an automated case record. This could be the STAR system, for example. There is a log of rental assistance payments that's usually kept by a case manager. I'm sure the fiscal office gets involved with that as well. And there's follow-up data that's also entered. And again, you're constantly, especially in a housing program of this nature, you are always in contact with the client, usually at least once a month, to really discover where they're at. And then if you're in a homeless shelter, you see the data is entered into the case record at the time of encounter, and also you rely on the shelter case manager's records and notes as well.
And Christine, I bet nearly everybody who is listening to us already knows the answers to these questions, but I wonder if it's written down. If it's written down, so if a stakeholder wanted to check the progress, or if a new employee had a question about how often something gets done, is there a place where you just hand them the logic model and say, this spells everything out for you? So even though you probably know it, it's a good thing to have it written down somewhere, documented.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the best points to be made of this, is that if you're using the logic model, that is an opportunity to really source out and be clear about who does what and when. And what a great way, not only just to show a stakeholder, that could be a board member, that could be an elected official, that could be a potential funder, but what a great opportunity too to provide some training for new staff, so it's very clear about the process that you're undertaking with your clients in that program. And then we'll just look briefly at column 8, which is the final accountability column. Is that this is your frequency of data collection and reporting. This actually tells you, the flow of data. You're gathering data initially, then you're doing a summary report. Perhaps there's a weekly report or a monthly report that is given to department heads or executive directors. There is a report, obviously, that would go to the state. Likewise, when families who experience homelessness, you're seeing data that is collected at the time of encounter, and typically because there's a daily record of their stay at the shelter, that there would be an electronic report, probably emailed to the agency or whatever other system that is set up between or an agreement between that homeless shelter and the CAAA. AAAA. There, I stuttered through all those A's. All right, so that's an example. So now we want to take a look at some logic models and see if these are logic models that kind of hit all of those things that we've talked about on that logic model checklist. So this is I will say this is a real logic model that's out there, and this is a family logic model that is a housing program, very similar to what we just discussed. So let's.
All right.
Yeah,
What I like about this is the need is families need access to safe and affordable housing, and the outcome is families obtain safe and affordable housing. So it's very clear what the problem is and how it can be solved. But then we have to worry about our services and activities. So 300 residents will be provided with housing and or housing services such as home buyer education, housing counseling, weatherization, energy saving strategies. That's a whole lot of services. I probably, if I were working in this agency on this program, would have separate logic models for the services, or at least delineate them, separate them so that each one has a separate outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because that's a big bucket that is currently, this logic model is serving as a big bucket for a lot of services that are all over the agency. I mean, in some respects, you can view this as an opportunity to bundle services, and you could probably think of doing a separate logic model for a bundled service approach. But again, I think this is where it might get out of control fairly easily.
We are completely in favor of bundled services, but I think to do this logic model correctly, it would need to be wall sized. So I would probably just break it down into one for the housing support service, one for home buyer education, one for housing counseling, one for weatherization, and so forth. I think that it would just simplify it. The ideas are great, but the logic model is not big enough.
Yeah, and that's just it, because each one of those programs require different data collection and data analysis and frequency of data reporting. So, to look overall at a program, I think that it's great from that perspective. Yeah, we want you to think about bundled services and their approaches, but also you need to be very clear when you're planning and evaluating your performance to how to break it down so you can tell each one of those stories, because that's the key piece of this. I will note that one of the really nice things I see under the outcome indicator column is that they are looking at the national performance indicators and noting them in the actual logic model. We see that every once in a while. It's nice to see it placed here.
It is nice. We don't see enough of that, but it clarifies it. It makes it quite simple. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, so I think that's a real positive. And you'll notice in this logic model that results are not yet noted. This is a planning logic model. This actually appeared in a community needs assessment and community action plan document. So the idea of the use of logic models within the community needs assessment and the community action plan is really a good idea to do, again, because it's laying out your programs. It's discussing your whole process, again, telling that story. And so it's good to see the progression, but also you have to be very mindful that if you don't want to load up the service and activity, and then you kind of drop off on the reporting of each one of those activities.
I will say, you had said earlier, Christine, that this is a planning logic model, and as so, maybe it's the first step before they break things down.
That's a really good point, Susan. Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's be mindful of that as well. So you'll see that they do list all these measurement tools, and this is where it makes me a little dizzy to see this. Um, because that's a lot of measurement tools to be looking at. If you're really looking at what's our need? Individuals need access to safe and affordable housing. Uh, so there's a lot loaded in there. So again, be mindful whenever you're using a logic model for planning purposes to think through each one of these pieces of measurement and how is it you're going to, what is your data source? How are we going to collect it? I hear they're using a system called Captain, which I am assuming is very similar to our stars. Um, and we're seeing a little bit in the frequency of data collection reporting in which it will occur monthly and be reported monthly in their system, and then outcomes reported annually via an annual report, which is good. That's great. But where's the other frequency of data collection and reporting in there too? Because it has to show up somewhere else other than an annual report and a monthly report. Typically, you're seeing these things weekly. Am I right?
Right.
All right. Are we ready for another one?
So we'll consider this a good example of a first step before the logic models for each service or each outcome or each program is developed. We'll consider it that way.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely. All right, let's kind of break down another one, shall we?
All right. This one is a logic model for health and safety. The need is residents need access to health education. The outcome is individuals will receive immunizations, meals, food, education services, mental, physical health. That is super wordy. The ideas are good. That is a need, and those things would help. But Christine, I think this too should probably be broken down. And I will say I have an issue calling this a community need.
Mm-hmm.
This is a family need because the residents need access to health education and resources. If it's truly a community need, then it should be listed that way. The community needs more health department offices, or the community needs more staff, or for the health department or the schools, whoever are providing these services. So it's listed as a community need, family and community, but it's really just a family need.
Right. So if it were, like you said, if it were a community need, we would see immediately that the community needs access to health education and so forth. But if we follow this whole logic model in a linear fashion, the community doesn't really show up. The only place that it really does but it's under the outcome indicator, which it lists again the community national performance indicator FI, and then so there's one that they're going for. We don't know what one that is off the top of my head, but
Oh,
again,
you don't have those memorized.
I don't, Susan. I've been working on it.
Disappoint me.
There's only
Okay.
so much that I can fit into this grade. And yeah, that's another story for another time. But I think what you're bringing up, Susan, is a really good point, is that immediately we have to understand the language that we use in a logic model. It all has to match. And so if we're portraying this as a community and family logic model, the community has to show up. But the community, honestly, is not showing up here.
Right, and there's absolutely no reason you could not create a second logic model for the community, and how can the community needs be addressed? The community, do you need more food programs? Does the community need more educational services to provide? Does the community, they're not the same thing. The individuals, the families are, and a family, of course, can be a single individual living alone. What does that person need? What do the people living with him need? The community is what services does the community as a whole need, such as a shelter. The community might need industry to come in to offer jobs. The community might need a health building like a hospital or emergency services. So They really should not be combined onto the same logic model because the needs are different, the outcomes are different, the measurement tools are different. So the ideas are good, but it's just not going to work on a
Right.
logic model this way.
And that's exactly right. And I'll just point out a couple of other things that under the measurement tools, those are all focused on residents or individuals. Again, you would want to have community surveys if or assessments or follow-ups, community meetings to see if you're being successful. And that also holds true if you go through the data source collection and frequency. And I will note that this is the same agency that we've pulled these logic models from, in that the frequency of data collection and reporting is exactly the same as the previous logic model. So that is something I think kind of flags to me that they're not thinking through perhaps some of their collection procedures. Okay, are we ready for one more?
Let's go on.
Let's just belabor this, shall we?
We're clarifying, not belaboring.
So here's an example of an agency logic model that's focused on professional development for the agency.
Okay, so the need is the staff and board need training. And the outcome is staff and board complete professional development. They get their training. So that makes sense. What I don't know is what kind of training. It says professional development, but what is really your outcome? Are they needing ROMA training? Are they needing fiscal training? Are they needing customer service training? So I think that should probably be spelled out here. And then for the results, once they receive the training, it says that they will be reported to the board through the annual report, but I would imagine that there's a lot more data collection than that. Perhaps they get certificates that are put in the personnel files. I would imagine there's a lot more to this than what's being listed.
Yeah, and again, just kind of thinking back, since this is a planning document, so this is just so general that we don't know, like you said, we don't know what type of training is the board getting specific board training. Some of these are mandated in the organizational standards. Board training certainly is, ROMA training certainly is, other professional development activities are perhaps not as closely identified, but they're there. And so I believe in a logic model for planning, as you said, you would want to be very, very focused on who is receiving what. And there's far more data collection, as you said. The board is going to be interested in this, certainly. There's no denying that. But I'm thinking about the CSBG annual report, in which it counts the number of family development folks that you have at the agency, the number of people who hold the ROMA credential, for example, and other credentials that are within our network. And so, again, this is where some granular planning in professional development is very useful. All right. So we really want to think then, we've talked about the value of the logic model, but also this is an opportunity to really do evaluation over time with a focus on potential improvement. And so that means you can use a logic model that has multiple dimensions.
That's right. The results of poverty aren't solved with one single service. Multiple problems, multiple services, outcomes, and documentation all need to be addressed over the long term, especially if we're dealing with generational poverty or a long-term lack of resources. This multi-dimension logic model could be a great tool to sit down with the family and show them how short-term goals, such as getting a job, can lead to intermediate goals, such as getting a job, that can then meet the longer-term goals, such as home ownership. But it takes planning, it takes services, it takes linkages, and it takes a pretty big logic model, but it can be done well. And I think that this really shows how it is a data map that we introduced this webinar with. It's a data map of goals and procedures and documentation.
Yeah, and I think the use of this, I think I'm kind of restating what you said, Susan, but I think the use of this logic model really demonstrates a community action agency's responsiveness to data analysis and its effectiveness in handling change and obtaining results. So again, because we know that poverty is multidimensional, logic models are multidimensional to try to capture all of those places needs that we need to address as we move forward. So here is an example. And actually, this is taking the previous logic model, the ROMA logic model that we had discussed, which was about emergency housing, and really looking at it from a perspective, that perspective of those multi-dimensions, looking at short-term for families who are at risk of being evicted versus families who are being homeless. And I believe what this does is it really enriches the story that you can tell about this program, what the performance looks like, what the accountability looks like. And this is really a key piece, I think, especially when we're looking at something as complicated as housing assistance. I will say that oftentimes I don't want to say we ignore it, but I don't think we value how dimensional this work is. It's not one and done. This isn't LIHEAP, which we can make the argument that that is a one and done, if you will, but it's also a door opener to the community action agency. But just take a moment. I realize it's a little blurry here, but what are some things that we would notice using this logic model? What I'm noticing is I really can follow exactly how the data is being collected and reported. And this is there's such clarity through this logic model that I am understanding where these families are at any given point when they're receiving housing assistance.
I like that the outcomes meet the needs, because so many times when people practice this, they don't quite get it. If the problem is families are being evicted, the outcome would be they stay in their residence. If the problem is they need services to maintain housing, the outcomes are they obtain permanent housing. Actually, that one should be they receive services to maintain housing. So make sure that your outcome meets your need. Make sure that your services can provide the outcome. Your indicators are what you can plan, and you know what? Sometimes we're wrong. Sometimes we think that we'll get 50% and we only get 30, or maybe we get 80%, but you have to have some kind of expectation of what's going to happen. And then your actual results, and how did you measure that? How do you know that you were successful, or that the family was successful, or how do you document that maybe something needs to be changed? And we do, of course, have our mission. The mission is that they have access to safe, clean shelter, and that's what our outcomes are. Remaining in their residence, they have an emergency shelter, they have subsidized housing.
Right.
So the outcomes meet the mission as well.
Right, absolutely. And again, you have to be very clear when you're putting your logic models together. Again, the key piece, and it's intentional that the mission is kind of in the support of the bottom of this logic model, because the mission supports the rest of the work. But also, to be very clear, this is a family logic model. So each one of these, from the identified problem all the way down to the frequency of data collection, is all focused on family outcomes.
If you notice at the top right of the model, you have your options of family, agency, or community. It's kind of hard to tell, but agency and community are X'd off. It's family that's checked. This is a family logic model. The problems are the family, and the outcomes affect the families.
Right. Okay. All right, come on, move. Here it goes.
Okay.
All right, so this is kind of pairing together a logic model and an outcome scale. And this may look familiar to you if you were on last week's webinar in which we discussed the scale. And so
The
this
gas
is
gauges.
the gas gauges, yes, the things that we all love. So the question maybe could be, which comes first, the logic model or the outcome scale? And the answer is that either one can be created independently. But to just look at this from the perspective of not combining these, but to see that the similarities in some of these, because our benchmarks are always, especially when we consider the family scale that we just discussed, that really considered housing. So let's look at what some of those benchmarks at housing are. Again, we're revisiting this from last week, but we see that the benchmarks for thriving is that it is securing home ownership, and that's a long-term outcome, right? And we know that. But if we're going to think about securing housing from a stable perspective, if you're remaining in your own residence, that might be a short-term outcome. If you're in public housing, that's a long-term outcome. And transitional is obviously an intermediate because you're transitioning from one to another. When we drop below that prevention line, that blue line, what exactly is vulnerable? Staying in an emergency shelter, a short-term outcome. And this is also where the need statement becomes a key piece of our documentation and understanding of where the client is, that if you are at risk of eviction, then that is from a need statement, and that's true if you're homeless. So we see the connection between the two. And again, what comes first, the scale or the logic model? I don't know. It's the chicken or the egg question in many respects. But to be very mindful that these can work in collaboration with one another, and the importance, honestly, of understanding, if we're going to be very clear of using short-term through long-term, that the scale is a great pairs very well with understanding what that is.
One of the things that we do in ROMA is look for a change in status, and this quantifies housing. You can move from vulnerable to stable, or from in crisis to safe. And so it quantifies, it gives you a specific level that the people can change from. So instead of just saying, well, they went from, couch surfing to at least in an apartment, well, no, they went from vulnerable to stable.
Right, and I think that really brings forward then, if you want to use a scale in conjunction with your logic model planning, you can add a couple of columns to a table that you've created, in which that you're going, in that housing program, you're going to project, let's say that one individual has the possibility of securing home ownership. So you've projected it, but you've noticed at the end of the program that didn't happen. So so that's a 0. But look at the other numbers that you can look within your projections. That safe, to maintain an unsubsidized affordable rental, you had projected 4, but 21 actually succeeded that. So that's an indicator to you. What did we do right? Why was that program so successful? So it prompts these really great questions. Again, looking at if we drop below that prevention line and we look at individuals who are at risk of eviction, we can identify those individuals as being vulnerable, and that you've projected that 150 would be able to receive services, and you see that the actual is 155. That is an indicator that perhaps at risk of eviction is a program that is needed, and perhaps we need to put more money into that. Perhaps we need to have more caseworkers that help us to work with individuals who are at risk of eviction.
Very good.
All right. So at the end of the day, and where we were going with all this, don't you? That this is really, it's an opportunity to analyze data from the perspective of using these tools that are available to us, the logic model, using the scale. That's really ROMA working, implementing ROMA is really using these tools and then following these stories. So it's an opportunity to aggregate the data. In this, you're bringing in discrete data together so it can be analyzed. Again, granular is our friend. You want to count the number of elements that are important. And I'm going to source back, Susan, to those logic model examples that we were using, especially the one with the community that had so much in it. It was difficult to count those number of elements, correct?
Yes, too much.
Yeah, way too much. And that's where we get overwhelmed, and we want to avoid that. You also want to be able to compare data elements to see relationships. It might actually increase the knowledge about the situation. It may inform how you shift your programs or shift who you reach out to or shift who you may partner with. And then you want to look at the trends. Again, that's what data collection is all about. We want to see what's happening. Is there a pattern emerging? And how can we use that to really, again, inform our very next steps?
All right. And analyzing data is part of the ROMA cycle when we do our assessments.
Yes, so here we have the ROMA cycle once again, and it's, again, this whole conversation over these past 5 weeks have been focused on implementing the ROMA cycle. So this is an opportunity for us to recognize really what the whole nature of the ROMA process is all about. It's an opportunity to gain commitment from all stakeholders, and that includes your board of directors. We will, I'll go out on a limb here and say that, that boards need to understand ROMA, not at the same level that you do as a community action staff member, but they have to understand the concepts. And I will say most of them do, because again, ROMA is a performance management system, and many of the individuals that serve on your boards are very familiar with performance management. You're looking at the development of outcomes for specific programs and services. Much of this you know already. It's, again, you look at your mission to lead the way on that conversation. You want to think about the development of outcome scales and putting those matrices together. We talked about those in last week's webinar. A lot of our agencies, not just in Illinois, but across the country, are identifying the ROMA professional as the internal quality assurance person. I think that's a great role for the ROMA professional at the agency. So this is something, again, to really consider. As you know, that we talked about, when is a customer? Many of us often use Social Security numbers as that unique customer qualifier. I think probably identifying a unique number to customers is a process that we may want to consider as we move forward. But I really think what this gets to is that it's the importance of data, the importance of being prepared to gather data, to examine data, and to report on that data is really some of the key pieces here. And I'm just going to skip to the very bottom.
The most important one.
The most important one that Susan and I are laser focused on. Really, this is providing ROMA training for all staff is necessary. It's important. Again, it's part of the organizational standards. But look beyond that. ROMA is really a way to understand how the agency in its totality is functioning and how programs interact with one another and how it fulfills not only the mission of the organization, but it tells the story of success and the story of how you are addressing poverty in the communities that you serve.
I look forward to when we can do this again in person, because there's so much more. A full day ROMA training really gets the staff, gives them an understanding of how their work can be documented, and we go through the ROMA cycle and how important it is to analyze and assess and to plan. And so I look forward to doing this again when I can be face to face with some of you.
Yeah, ditto. I am very excited. I'm very itchy to get out and see everybody and want to really share this. And I have to say, Susan, you have really brought so much information about ROMA, and you've really changed how I think about it, and so I really appreciate that.
It's not scary. I want you to know that.
Yeah.
it seems scary, but it really just documents what you do. It maps it out, it plans it out, it documents it. You do good work. Sometimes I don't think we pat ourselves on the back enough, and Roma can help us do that. Let our stakeholders know that we do good work, and this is how we know that what we do is good work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the thing that we need to kind of recall um, when we get to this idea of reinventing organizations, we're not really suggesting a reinvention. We are
No.
suggesting an opportunity to really dive into what you know and really flesh out much of the work that you're doing. And you're doing it already. It's just a matter of kind of putting on your Roma glasses and taking a peek inside to see, okay, let's tell our story. So this reinventing organizations idea was a book that was written or based on a book that was written in 1994 or 1992, excuse me, and this was right when GIPRA, the Government Performance and Results Act, during the Clinton administration, Al Gore was Vice President Al Gore was put in charge of GIPRA, so this is a book that emerged during that time. And what they did, the authors of this book, Reinventing Government, David Osborne and Ted Gabler, put together a list of 7 things. And at the top of that list is what gets measured gets done. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. If we are taking the time and energy to set up a system that allows us to really measure, that means that we are completing something. We are moving towards results. And a couple of other pieces of or nuggets of wisdom from this list of 7 things, and you'll get the whole list if you come to a Roma training. So there's a teaser for you. Um, if the fourth one is if you cannot reward success, you are probably rewarding failure, and I think that's an interesting one to think about. But I think the most important one is number 7, is that if you can demonstrate results, you can win public support. And we are in a time in which community action is so far more important than ever, that people need us. And there's been a recognition, I think, from our leaders that we get things done. So it's, I think, the time, even though we measure, let's keep measuring, let's keep moving forward, and let's really tell the story of community action.
Very good.
All right, I think that brings us to the end, if I am not mistaken. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Christine.
And thanks to all of you for being a part of this today. There will be a survey that gets launched at the end of this webinar, and I believe you'll get it in an email again tomorrow, but we would really appreciate you responding to that survey. Tell us how it's going. We will have another Roma webinar next week. We will start unpacking Roma Next Generation. There are some new tools and approaches within Roma Next Generation that you do need to be made aware of. Susan has graciously agreed to come back with us next week, and we may try to even have another another speaker with us. We'll see what happens. So there's a teaser out there for you as well.
Yes, maybe we'll spice it up a bit.
Yeah. So again, Susan, thank you, and thank you all for participating today. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Take good.
Please let us know if you have any questions, you want more information, any clarifications, any documents. We're happy to share.
Absolutely. We're here for you. So take good care, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.